I woke up a little after 6 in the morning, like almost every day since I moved into my daughter's house. The room where I sleep is at the end of the hall, small, with a window that barely lets in the dawn light. At that hour you can always hear the creak of the old pipes and the hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. I sat on the edge of the bed, stretched my back, and put on the flannel shirt that's already a bit worn at the elbows. Then I folded the blanket carefully, like Linda always did, and looked at my watch. It's the watch she left me, the only object I still carry with me every day. Sometimes, when the sun hits the watch face, it seems like I can still see her fingers fastening it on my wrist. I went down the stairs slowly so as not to wake Catherine. In the kitchen, I opened the refrigerator and took out the beef, a couple of carrots, and a large onion. Whenever I can, I make her favorite stew. She loved that smell since she was a little girl, said it reminded her of Sundays with her mom. I chopped the vegetables on the cutting board while the small radio I brought with me murmured the day's news at a low volume. The click of the knife, the mumble of the announcer. It was my way of starting the morning. I heard footsteps behind me. Brian crossed the kitchen without even saying hello. He twisted his mouth as if something stank and said the smell was too strong. I calmly replied that it was the stew Catherine had always loved, but he just walked on, huffing, as if my presence in that kitchen was a constant annoyance. I tossed the vegetables into the pan with a little oil, and the smell began to rise, warm and familiar. I uncovered the pot and, with the ladle, stirred the meat so it wouldn't stick. Just then, Brian returned, this time with his phone in his hand and his brow tightly furrowed. Apparently, he was in a video call meeting, and the sound of the utensil hitting the pot bothered him. "Can you stop making noise?" he said, raising his voice more than necessary. I apologized and lowered the heat a bit, but he approached the stove, sniffed the air, and wrinkled his nose. "This kitchen smells horrible. Don't turn this house into a cheap diner." I just said I would try not to let the smell spread, that I would close the lid and open the window. I didn't even finish the sentence when he tore the ladle from my hand, with such force that I almost lost my balance. Before I could react, he flipped the ladle and pressed the metal part, still hot, against the back of my hand. I heard a dry sound, as if my skin had sizzled. I felt an immediate piercing burn so strong that I dropped the rag I was holding in my other hand. A little broth splashed and stained the edge of the stove. I stood still, breathing deeply so as not to scream. At that moment, Catherine came down the stairs in her bathrobe. Seeing me holding my red hand and seeing the ladle thrown in the sink, she opened her eyes wide with concern. "What happened?" she asked, coming closer. Before I could say anything, Brian answered, "Your dad almost burned the house down. He doesn't know how to cook, Catherine." I tried to downplay it, said I was just making the usual stew, but Brian looked at me with that face he uses when he wants to expose me. Catherine looked at my hand, saw the red mark, but said nothing. Her gaze moved to Brian as if asking for permission to speak, but he shot her a look so harsh that she took a step back. Then he walked to the radio and turned it off abruptly. "Start over," he told me, "and this time, do it right." He threw the ladle into the sink like it was trash. I picked up the rag and cleaned the stove, trying to ignore the sting that shot up from the burned skin. Brian threw the windows wide open, almost violently, as if the air in the house was poison. Catherine approached with a glass of warm water. She had barely put it in my hands when Brian called her from the living room. "We need to talk. Now." She left the glass on the counter and walked away without looking back. I was left alone in the kitchen, with my hand burning and the pot unfinished. I started chopping another onion to prepare the stew again. My eyes were watering. I don't know if it was from the onion or from the mix of pain and shame that enveloped me. From the living room I heard their voices, low at first, then gradually rising. Brian had that dry, commanding tone. Catherine barely responded. No matter how much I focused on chopping the vegetables, every word came through clearly. "I can't stand having a decrepit old man here," Brian said. "This isn't a nursing home." I pressed my lips together and stirred the pot, trying to ignore the knot forming in my chest. I tasted a bit of the broth with a small spoon. Even though my hand was shaking, I knew the flavor was right. I covered the pot and let it simmer on low heat. My phone vibrated in my pocket. It was a promotional message from the phone company. It took me several tries to swipe the screen because my burned hand wasn't responding well. I stared at the reddish, swollen skin, wondering how long it would take for the pain to subside. When the stew was ready, I turned off the stove and set the pot aside to cool a bit. I wanted to serve some for Catherine before she left for work, like I always did. But before I could grab a plate, Brian entered the kitchen again. He looked at the pot and let out a dry laugh. "Nobody is going to eat that. Eat it yourself." Catherine was behind him, standing in the doorway. She didn't look me in the eyes. She just lowered her head and nodded weakly, obeying her husband's decision as if she no longer had a will of her own. I said nothing. I just carefully picked up the pot, carried it to a corner of the kitchen, and left it on a low shelf. I kept silent, so as not to make things worse, not to provoke another argument. I felt the urge to ask them to at least try it, but I stopped myself. I didn't have the strength anymore. I covered the pot, took a deep breath, and tried not to spill anything as I moved it. The smell of the stew, the same smell that filled our house for so many happy years, now seemed out of place in this home where I no longer fit. And that's how that day began. A day that, although I didn't know it at the time, would be the beginning of my fall, and also the beginning of something that would change my entire life. That morning, after the stew was set aside in the kitchen corner, I tried to focus on making a simple breakfast. I scrambled a couple of eggs, put slices of bread in the toaster, and squeezed 3 oranges because Catherine always prefers natural juice, nice and fresh. I moved slowly, careful not to hit anything, not to make noise. The burned skin on my hand was still hot and stung every time I stretched it, but I chose to ignore it. I told myself the important thing was for Catherine to start her day peacefully. I had just finished setting the table when Brian came downstairs with his laptop in one hand and a cup of coffee in the other. He sat down without a greeting, opened the computer, and put on his headphones. "I'm joining a meeting," he said in a warning tone. "Stay out of the camera shot. Stay away." Catherine appeared behind him, her hair hastily tied up. She gave me a small smile, almost like an automatic reflex. "Dad, if you want, you can sit with us," she murmured. But Brian looked up from his laptop and shot her a death glare. "I'd prefer my colleagues not to see this," he said, waving his hand in my direction without even looking at me. I felt as if I were being pushed into an invisible corner. I ended up sitting at the very end of the table, barely touching the chair, like an awkward guest in my own family. I looked down at my plate, trying not to interrupt anything. Brian took a bite of egg, frowned, and pushed the plate aside. "This is bland," he complained. "Is it that hard to add some salt?" Catherine, without a second thought, said, "I'm sorry, love. I'll get you something else if you want." I sat frozen, with a lump in my throat. I was the one who cooked it, but she preferred to apologize rather than contradict him. I tried to say that I could make another plate, that maybe the seasoning was too light, but Brian raised his hand, cutting me off. "Don't make excuses. When something's wrong, it's wrong. That's it." I swallowed hard and looked down. There was something in his voice that made the words heavier, as if each syllable was being driven into the air. A few minutes passed. Brian snapped his laptop shut. "I need to talk to you," he said to Catherine. "In the living room." She followed him without a word. I heard the soft slam of the door, as if he had tried not to make it loud, but it still echoed in my chest. I was left alone in the kitchen, trying to distract myself by tidying up the dishes. The silence didn't last long. Through the wall, I began to hear the argument grow. Brian's voice got louder and louder, sharp, harsh. Catherine responded in a whisper that barely reached me. I tried to get away from the noise by moving the stew pot to reheat it a little. The aroma helped me breathe better, although my burned hand started to throb again. As I lifted the pot to place it on the burner, the handle slipped, slick with sweat and the sting of my skin. The pot slipped from my grasp. The crash on the floor sounded like a brief explosion. The stew spread everywhere, on the tiles, the small rug, the base of the cabinets. The impact also knocked over 2 plates that were drying in the rack, shattering them. Within seconds, Brian burst into the kitchen as if someone had yelled fire. Catherine was right behind him, her eyes swollen. "What did you do now?" Brian yelled. "Are you sabotaging my house on purpose?" I immediately knelt on the floor, trying to gather the ceramic fragments without making more of a mess. But my burned hand forced me to pause for a second. The pain was too much. Catherine bent down to help me, but Brian grabbed her arm and pulled her up. "Leave him. He cleans this. It's his mess," he said coldly. Then he took out his phone and started taking pictures, moving around the puddle of stew like a detective at a crime scene. "This is evidence," he said as he snapped photos. "I'm not paying a cent for damage caused by him." I tried to explain that it was an accident, that the pot was hot, and my burned hand wasn't responding well. But he let out a short, bitter laugh. Accident? He repeated. Yesterday you spilled red wine on the carpet. The day before you broke a bottle of oil. How many more times before you admit you're just a burden? I felt my chest tighten as if someone was squeezing it. Catherine looked at her husband, then at me, with the silent desperation of someone trapped between two walls. I knew she wanted to help me, wanted to defend me, but she couldn't open her mouth without Brian crushing her with another look. I bent down to clean up the stew with an old rag. Every movement made the burned skin hurt more, but I preferred that to the sharp silence that had taken over the house. Even the sound of my fingers brushing the floor seemed too loud. Brian turned around and said, "When you're finished, make sure there's not a single drop left. I don't want any smells. And if you hurt yourself, it's not my problem." He slammed the living room door. The frame rattled slightly. Catherine stood in the doorway for a few seconds. She looked like she wanted to walk towards me, but Brian called her from inside. "Catherine," he said with that voice full of control, "come here now." She pressed her lips together, glanced up at me briefly, and then lowered her head. She took a step back and closed the door behind her. I was alone again. The smell of the stew on the floor, mixed with the broken ceramic, made my stomach clench. I moved carefully, picking up every piece, cleaning every stain, breathing through my mouth so I wouldn't feel my chest close up with sadness. When I finally finished and stood up, leaning on the counter because my back ached, Brian came out of the living room. He looked at my hand, which was still red and swollen. "If you hurt yourself more, deal with it alone. I'm not responsible for anything," he said without emotion, like someone reading a notice posted on the street. Then he went upstairs without waiting for a reply. Catherine stayed behind, at the edge of the hallway. Her eyes were glassy, her shoulders slumped. She looked at me for a long time, as if she wanted to say 1,000 things and couldn't say any of them. The house was so quiet I could hear the ticking of the dining room clock. That silence, her silence, that's what hurt the most. Because it was the silence of the person who had protected my heart the most for years. She said nothing. And her silence made me understand something I hadn't wanted to accept, that I no longer belonged in that house. That, little by little, they were pushing me towards the door, not with shouts, not with blows, just with a silence that said everything. That afternoon, the heat of the day began to fade, but my hand continued to burn as if the wound had deepened. I sat in one of the patio chairs, far from the noise inside the house. Catherine, before leaving for work, had discreetly passed me a bag of ice wrapped in a kitchen towel. "Put this on for a while, Dad," she said in a low voice so Brian wouldn't hear. I sat there, holding the bag on the swollen skin, feeling the momentary relief of the cold. The patio was newly decorated. Catherine had chosen the plants, but Brian insisted on buying the new furniture. A long beige sofa, a small wooden table, 2 modern design chairs. They had nothing to do with my daughter's style, but it was obvious who made the decisions in that house. I was trying to distract myself by watching the sunlight filter through the leaves of the tree when I heard the sliding door open abruptly. Brian came out with a cold beer in one hand and a sheaf of papers in the other. He didn't even look at me at first. He went straight to the table, set the bottle down, and watched me as if I were an intruder sitting in his garden. "What are you doing out here?" he asked, as if he couldn't stand finding me in any corner of the house. "And don't sit on that sofa. It's new, you'll get sweat on it." I stood up slowly, trying not to show that my hand still hurt. "I was just getting some air," I said. "I'm going in." I took a step toward the door, but he stood in front of me, blocking the way. His shadow fell right on top of mine. "No, wait," he said, holding out the papers. "Read this." I took the sheet with my good hand. The title read House Rules for Temporary Stay. It was a document he had written, in large letters with narrow margins. I read each line very slowly. "Do not use the kitchen after 8 p.m. Do not use the living room at any time. Do not make noise during meetings or work sessions. Do not use the washer or dryer during peak hours. Pay for your own food and hygiene items." I was silent for a moment. I didn't understand what was happening. Catherine had never mentioned any of this. Never. "What is all this about?" I asked, trying to stay calm. Brian took a swig of beer and shrugged, as if it were obvious. "This house isn't a nursing home. If you want to stay temporarily, you follow the rules. Simple as that." I felt a strange mix of shame and disbelief. I opened my mouth to tell him that I cooked, I cleaned, I did the shopping, that I had never asked for anything, that I was only trying to help. I started to say. He cut me off. You're not helping. You're trying to control the kitchen like it's yours. It's not. And Catherine is going to sign these rules tonight, so you better start thinking if that sounds fair to you. I froze. Not because of the words, but because of the certainty with which he said them, as if Catherine had already decided something without me knowing. I handed the sheet back to him carefully. I want to talk to Catherine first, I requested, before she signs anything. That's all. Brian sighed as if I had asked for a huge favor. Make it quick, he said. When Catherine got home from work, it was almost 7. She looked tired, her shoulders tense, her hair down. As soon as she walked in the door, Brian was already waiting for her. He said something to her in a low voice, but his tone was anything but gentle. She barely had time to set down her purse when he took her arm and led her toward the bedroom. The door shut with a slam. I stayed in the kitchen, drying the same dish rag for the umpteenth time, trying to keep my hands busy so I wouldn't listen, but the walls were thin. I could hear their voices from the hallway, and every phrase cut through me like a cold thread. First Brian's tone, then Catherine's muffled crying, then, suddenly, either he goes or I go. You decide, Brian said, in that tone that accepted no argument. Catherine replied with something, but so quietly I couldn't understand her. I only heard a choked sob, as if she were trying to ask him to lower his voice. I stared at the sink without really seeing it. I didn't know where to put my hands. I didn't know where to put my pain. The bedroom door opened. Brian came out first, with a hard expression that gave nothing away. In his hand he was carrying my suitcase. My suitcase. Catherine walked behind him, her eyes full of tears, clutching her phone. Brian left my suitcase by the front door, as if it were a package that had arrived in the mail. Catherine approached me slightly. Her voice was a very thin thread. Dad, maybe. Maybe it would be good if you found another place for a few days, just until things calmed down. It was the first time I had heard her speak like that, as if she wasn't my daughter, as if she was afraid of irritating someone else. You want me to leave? I asked. She looked away. She didn't say yes, but she didn't say no. Brian intervened immediately. It's best if you leave as soon as possible. This house isn't big enough for 3 adults, especially one who doesn't know how to respect other people's space. He took out his wallet, grabbed $200 bills, and crumpled them into my hand. Here, a cheap motel should be enough. Don't say I didn't help. I looked up at Catherine. She opened her mouth as if wanting to say something, but Brian put his hand on her shoulder. You don't need to talk to him anymore, he told her. She swallowed and nodded. I stood there for a moment, looking at my suitcase on the floor. Then I said, I don't want to cause any more trouble. I'll leave today. Catherine tried to smile, but the corner of her mouth trembled. Her eyes were wet. I wanted to hug her, to tell her it was okay, not to worry. But Brian had already opened the door and was pointing outside. Go on, he ordered. It's not my fault it's getting dark. I picked up my suitcase. The sound of the wheels on the threshold was the last thing I heard before the door closed behind me, hard, dry, like a sentence. The sky was darkening. The streetlights were starting to come on, one by one. The air felt colder than usual, maybe because I no longer had a roof to return to. I tried to call a taxi, but when I turned on my phone, I saw the message 2% battery. I didn't even have time to open the app. So I started walking. The suitcase felt heavier than usual, or maybe it was me who was more tired than ever. I reached the nearest bus stop and sat on a plastic bench that was freezing cold. There weren't many people, just a sleeping man and a woman rummaging through her bag restlessly. When the bus finally arrived, I paid the fare with $1.75 and sat by the window. I watched the lights pass by like blurry smudges. The bus went through streets I knew well, past houses where I had once worked fixing pipes, changing faucets, installing water heaters, but now it all passed by, as if it had never been part of my life. I got off downtown. The streets were full of noise, but I only heard my own breathing. I looked for a cheap hotel, one I had stayed at once when I worked out of town, but it was full. I went to the next one, also full. I asked at another, booked solid. In the end, I wound up in front of a park. The park was right across from the public library. It had stone benches, a dry fountain, and a few dry bushes. I chose a bench that was somewhat clean and left my suitcase next to my legs. The cold of the night enveloped me immediately. I put on the old coat I always carry with me. I closed my eyes for a moment, trying not to think about anything. And so, my first night without a home began, without a plan, without knowing what I was going to do the next day. Just me, my suitcase, and a silence that seemed bigger than the whole city. The night wind grew colder than I had imagined. It seeped through every seam of my coat as if looking for a gap to settle in my bones. I zipped up my coat to my neck and hunched my shoulders forward to save some warmth. The stone bench was ice cold, hard as freshly set concrete, and even though I tried to lean my back against the edge, the cold quickly rose from the surface to my skin. I looked around. The park was almost empty, except for some yellowish lights that flickered as if they were about to go out. In the distance, a group of young guys walked among the trees, talking too loudly for the time of night. Their laughter mixed with stray words I couldn't make out, but the mocking tone put me on alert. I gripped the handle of my suitcase tighter, as if that piece of luggage was the last thing keeping me from getting completely lost. They didn't even look at me as they passed, but instinct told me it was better to keep everything close. A woman was pushing a shopping cart full of empty cans and plastic bags. She was wearing warm but old clothes, and she walked shuffling her feet with a slow rhythm. When she passed in front of me, she stopped for a second. She looked me up and down, as if trying to guess how long I'd been on the street. Then she slowly shook her head without a word, and continued on her way to another end of the park. The sound of the cart's wheels echoed off the cold tiles and faded into the distance. The City Hall clock tower struck 11 with a dry sound. I tried to lie on my side to avoid the lamppost light shining directly in my face. I closed my eyes, but the cold air seeped in from everywhere. I had barely managed to get comfortable when a white beam of light hit me. I opened my eyes and saw a park security guard holding a powerful flashlight pointed right at my face. "Are you planning to stay here tonight?" he asked, not unkindly, but without much patience either. I nodded. "Just for today," I replied. The guard watched me for a few more seconds and then said, "Don't make a scene or light any fires. Families come through here early in the morning," and he continued his round. I tried to close my eyes again. But around midnight, the sound of an ambulance pierced the park, its lights reflecting off the nearby buildings. I sat up with a start, my heart pounding in my chest. The bench had left my back stiff, and when I tried to straighten up, I heard my joints crack as if I'd been sleeping outdoors for years. Not far away, an older man, stooped and with tangled white hair, walked towards me. He limped slightly and seemed to carry the weariness of a lifetime in his steps. He stopped in front of me and raised a finger in greeting. "I'm Mickey," he said in a hoarse voice. "Mechanic. Well, I was, about 20 years ago." I shook his hand. His was cold, but firm. "Jonathan," I replied. "I don't have any food, if that's what you're asking." He smiled with one side of his mouth and started searching inside a plastic bag he was carrying. "Nobody has food here," he said, "but I got lucky today." He pulled out half a stale loaf of bread, wrapped in a crumpled napkin, and held it out to me. "Eat it. The night is freezing, and if you don't eat, you'll wake up shattered tomorrow." I accepted it with a thank you that came out more sincere than I expected. I ate slowly, even though the bread was dry and hard to chew, but the simple fact of having something in my stomach brought back a little warmth. Mickey sat on the next bench and looked around, like someone who knows the patterns of the street. "Sometimes the police come by around 4, he commented. "They don't like us sleeping on the benches. If you want to sleep without being kicked out, come with me." I followed him to the front of the library. Under a small overhang, 3 people were already lying on cardboard. One was snoring, another seemed to be awake staring at the ground, and the third had their head tucked under a very thin blanket. Mickey unfolded a piece of cardboard and placed it on the ground. "Lie down here. It's not comfortable, but it's better than the ground." I sat down slowly on the cardboard. It wasn't warm, but at least it wasn't as hard as the bench. I lay down slowly, covering my head with my coat to block the light from the downtown streets. The sound of cars on the avenue mixed with the occasional sound of a cough. Once, someone walked nearby and kicked an empty can, and the metallic echo bounced off the library walls. I tried to relax, but every so often my burned hand would start to throb with pain under my coat sleeve. Around 1 in the morning, the cold intensified. The skin where I had the burn began to sting again, as if the freezing air was getting under it. I searched for my phone in my pocket. The screen lit up with a faint glow. 6% battery. I thought for a moment before typing. In the end, I wrote just a few words. I'm okay. Take care, sweetheart. I pressed send. No reply came. I turned off the phone to save what little battery was left and lay down again. But sleep wouldn't come. In the distance, a group of young people passed by on bicycles, laughing and shouting things at those of us sleeping under the overhang. One of them said something like, "Get a job," and let out an exaggerated laugh. Mickey got up, raised his hand, and told them to get lost. The kids continued on their way, laughing as if it were a game. Minutes later, a police car circled the park. The blue and red lights lit up the pavement, and I heard the car's radio spitting out codes I didn't understand. An officer got out and walked toward us. "Keep it down," he said simply. "I'll be back in an hour." No further comment. Just that. He left. I tried to sleep again, adjusting my body on the cardboard, but every position felt worse than the last. My back burned, my shoulders were tense, and the cold was seeping in through my shoes. Around 4, I heard a hum. It was the vending machine in front of the library, turning on again. I approached it with the $2 I had left and punched in the number for a bottle of water. The machine made a couple of sounds, swallowed the money, and finally displayed a message in red. Error. I hit the button gently. Nothing. The money was gone. I stared at the machine as if it could explain to me why life had turned so bitter so quickly. I felt a weight in my chest, a mix of anger and resignation. $2 is nothing to many. For me, that night, it was all I had. Mickey came up behind me and put a hand on my shoulder. "Sometimes that's how the street is," he said in a low voice. "It takes more than it gives." I nodded without a word. We went back to the library overhang. I sat down on the cardboard again, hugged my suitcase, and watched as the sky slowly began to lighten. A very soft orange hue spread behind the buildings, pushing the darkness into the corners. I closed my eyes for a few seconds. I wasn't asleep, just tired, very tired. That sunrise marked something I never thought I'd experience. My first night as a homeless man. A man who had a family, a house, a life, and who was now sitting on a piece of cardboard, waiting for the sun to rise to feel a little less cold. After that night under the library overhang, I woke up with my body numb and my mouth dry. Mickey touched my shoulder gently with his fingertips, like someone waking up a person who has slept too little. "Come on, Jonathan," he said. "The church on the corner gives breakfast until 9. If we don't get there early, the bread runs out." I packed up my suitcase, stood up as best I could, and followed him. We walked 2 blocks to a gray building with a white cross at the entrance. In the courtyard, there was a long line of people, most with broken backpacks, old coats, or shopping carts full of things that were essential to them. The air smelled like cheap coffee and toast. Mickey showed me where to stand in line. We waited about 20 minutes. When we finally got to the front, a young volunteer with a red scarf and eyes full of energy asked me if I wanted a scarf or a hot towel. "A handkerchief, please," I replied. She took out a light gray one, folded it carefully, and handed it to me as if she were giving me something valuable. I took a tray with 2 pieces of toast, a little peanut butter, and a cup of watery coffee. I sat on the church steps while the morning sun tried to warm the air a little. I looked around. There were old people wrapped in blankets, young men with lost gazes, women trying to calm their children, all gathered in that courtyard as if it were a makeshift refuge for tired souls. I wondered at what point I had ended up there, mixed among them. Yesterday, I was at my daughter's house. Today, I was in line for a free breakfast. Mickey sat next to me and told me that today he would try to find another place to sleep because the police usually cleared out the downtown area at night. "I don't want an officer to catch you at 4 in the morning, he warned. "They can be tough, you know." I nodded. At that point, any practical advice was worth a lot to me. Before leaving, I opened my suitcase to organize the few things I had. As I checked the small inner compartment, I touched something soft and familiar. It was Linda's brown coat, the same one she wore every winter, the one that still had her faint perfume if you brought your nose close. I took it out carefully. As I shook it to fold it, a pale yellow envelope fell onto my legs. I froze for a few seconds. In a corner of the envelope, I recognized Linda's handwriting. She had that firm stroke that never changed, even when she was sick. I sat down next to a tree to open it calmly, My hands were shaking from the cold, but also from something else, something I couldn't name. Inside the envelope, there was a letter and several neatly folded documents. I had barely read the first words. If you are reading this, it's because I couldn't tell you in person. When a church employee came by, announcing that the courtyard had to be cleared to prepare for Mass, I quickly put the letter inside my jacket pocket and walked away from the building with Mickey. We found a bench near the library, where the traffic was less heavy. The wind moved some dry leaves behind us. I sat down, took out the letter again, and opened it with both hands. Linda's voice seemed to rise from the lines. Jonathan, I know you've always been responsible, even more than you had to be. That's why I needed to leave this for you without anyone else interfering. I want you to have something secure when I'm gone. My vision started to blur. I blinked several times until the letters came back into focus. I kept reading. Linda wrote that for years she had invested in small buildings, commercial properties, and some properties she had bought at a good price before they appreciated. She had kept it a secret because she wanted to give it to me as a gift for my old age, so I wouldn't have to keep breaking my back working with pipes and tools. With trembling hands, I opened the additional documents. There were 13 property deeds. 13, all in my name. Some buildings, some apartments, even small storefronts. I reviewed them one by one, unable to believe what I was seeing. And there, on one of the deeds, I recognized the name Westwood Oaks. The same building where Catherine and Brian lived. My stomach did a flip. How was it possible that I was the owner of the building where my own son-in-law had thrown me out as if I were nothing? I ran my finger over the printed address, once, twice, 3 times, to make sure I wasn't hallucinating. Mickey came back from talking to another man and saw me holding the papers. What do you have there? He asked. Just some things from my wife. Memories, I replied, quickly putting the documents away. Mickey nodded, without asking any more questions. Take care of them, he said. Out here, if they see you have papers or something important, they'll try to steal it. Don't let your guard down. I put everything in the inner pocket of my jacket and zipped it up all the way. Suddenly, a few cold drops fell on my head. Within seconds, it started to drizzle. Mickey pointed to the library overhang, and we ran towards it. The water splashed from the sides and wet the floor. I placed the papers on my legs and tried to protect them with my body. I used the gray handkerchief they had given me to dry the damp corners. The smell of wet paper made my heart race. It was as if I was trying to save the last thing I had left of my life. A library employee came out to remind us not to block the entrance. I apologized and took a couple of steps to the side. Then I checked my phone. Only 4% battery. I asked Mickey if he knew a place where I could charge it. He nodded without hesitation. Yeah, he said, there's a hidden outlet at a bus stop. Not many people know about it. I followed him in the light rain. The outlet was under a metal bench, almost invisible. I plugged in my charger and waited for the phone to come back to life a bit. As the percentage slowly climbed, I opened the documents again. On the last page there was a name underlined, Samuel Ortiz, lawyer, and below it a phone number. My heart pounded. Maybe he could explain all this. When the phone reached 7%, I made up my mind. I dialed the number with cold fingers and pressed the phone to my ear. The voice that answered was calm, mature. Yes. This is Jonathan Ale, I said. I believe you knew my wife, Linda. There was a brief, loaded silence. Then the voice changed. Jonathan? Is that really you? We've been looking for you for 6 months. Where are you right now? I looked around. The bus stop was damp, with puddles shining under a gray sky. At a bus stop downtown, I replied, feeling strange saying it. Don't move, he ordered. We'll send someone to pick you up immediately. I hung up. I put the phone away, still shaking, and sat on the cold bench. The water was still falling, though softer now. Mickey watched me from the side. Everything okay? He asked. I have to see someone, an acquaintance, I replied, not knowing how to explain something I couldn't even understand myself. About 25 minutes passed before a black sedan parked in front of the bus stop. A man in a dark suit got out of the car and walked towards me with a confident stride. He had a folder under his arm and was holding a small sign with my name written on it. Mr. Ale, he said, nodding his head. I'm from Mr. Ortiz's office. He's waiting for you. The man carefully took my suitcase, opened the back door of the vehicle, and invited me to get in as if I were someone important. and as he closed the door behind me, still soaked from the rain, I thought that maybe the story of my life wasn't over. Maybe it was just beginning. The black sedan drove through several streets I knew by heart, though I hadn't been through there in years. I had fixed pipes on those same blocks. I had carried toolboxes under the summer sun, and I had greeted neighbors I wouldn't even remember if I saw them again. I never imagined that one day I would return to these avenues as a passenger in an elegant car with a driver in a suit opening the door for me. I felt a strange mix of shame, exhaustion, and a premonition I didn't know was good or bad. The car stopped in front of a huge, dark glass building in the middle of the Los Angeles financial district. The automatic doors opened and cool air, smelling of freshly cleaned marble, came out to meet us. The driver gestured for me to follow. My worn-out boots echoed on the shiny floor as we walked to the reception. There were people coming and going with folders, elegant backpacks, phones pressed to their ears. I felt like an intruder. A young receptionist greeted us with a professional smile. She gave me a quick glance, as if trying to figure out what I was doing there, but then she politely asked if we had an appointment. The driver handed her Samuel Ortiz's business card. She nodded, typed something into her computer, and directed us to the elevator. We went up to the 14th floor. When the doors opened, I found myself in a quiet, carpeted hallway, decorated with black and white pictures of old buildings. The driver walked to door 1407 and knocked twice. A man in a gray suit came out immediately. It was Samuel. He had graying hair, thin glasses, and a firm but calm gaze. When he saw me, he approached without hesitation, as if confirming the presence of someone he had been waiting for months. "Mr. Al," he said. Finally. He shook my hand firmly and led me in. The smell of polished wood filled the office. There was a large table, shelves with labeled binders, and a window that overlooked half of downtown Los Angeles. Samuel pointed to a chair next to his desk. Seeing me shiver a little, he found a mug, filled it with hot water, and added a tea bag. "Drink something hot," he said. "Are you safe now?" I took the mug, felt the steam on my face, and for the first time in days, a faint but real sense of relief washed over me. I took Linda's envelope and all the documents I had been guarding as if they were my life from my jacket. Samuel received them carefully, as if he also felt their emotional weight. He reviewed them one by one, comparing them with digital files on his computer. I heard the sound of the mouse, the soft typing, his small murmurs. After a few minutes, he looked up. "Everything is in order," he announced. "You are the legal owner of 13 properties." I said nothing. I didn't know what to say. It was too much information for a man who had slept on a piece of cardboard just the night before. Samuel continued speaking, explaining that they had been trying to locate me for months. They had called Catherine's house, they had sent letters, but Brian never provided my information. I felt a lump in my throat. It wasn't a surprise, but hearing it confirmed by a stranger, it hurt. Samuel opened a safe and took out a thick file. He placed it in front of me. "Here is all of Mrs. Linda's history," he said. "Purchase agreements, renovations, lease contracts, personal notes. She was very meticulous." I picked up the notebook where Linda had written in her firm hand. There were lists of expenses, names of tenants, notes on pending repairs. She had built all of this in silence, without bothering me, without showing off. She always said she didn't want me to work until my back gave out. And still, I never knew the magnitude of what she was doing. Samuel watched me as I turned the pages. "Forgive me for asking," he said softly. "Where are you living right now?" I swallowed. My voice came out almost as a whisper. "On the street. I slept outside last night." Samuel's expression changed immediately. He stood up, took his cell phone, and gave quick instructions to someone. There was no hesitation or surprise, only action. Then he looked at me again. "You can't go on like this. A car will take you to a hotel right now." I wanted to say it wasn't necessary, but he stopped me with a wave of his hand. "It's not a favor, Mr. Ale. It's the least you deserve." The driver returned and accompanied me back to the elevator. We went down to the lobby, got into the sedan, and drove to a place I had only ever seen from the outside. The Paramount Regency, a hotel I had always considered to be for the rich. The driver opened the door, helped carry my suitcase, and guided me to the reception. The receptionist swiped a room keycard and handed it to me with a smile. "Executive Suite, 19th floor. Have an excellent stay." I took the elevator. When I reached the top, the door to the suite opened with a soft beep. I stood still for a few seconds, not daring to go all the way in. It was like entering another life. The room was huge. The white bed looked more comfortable than any I had slept in years. There was a balcony with a view of the entire city. The bathroom gleamed with light marble and soft lights. The driver left my suitcase in a corner and wished me a good night. When I was alone, I opened the minibar, took a bottle of cold water and an apple. I hadn't tasted fresh fruit in days. I sat on the bed with the apple in my hand, as if it were a luxury I didn't yet deserve. Then I went to the bathroom. I turned on the shower and let the hot water cascade over my neck, my back, my hands. I felt the grime of the street wash away, felt the heat restore a little of my dignity. I closed my eyes. I didn't cry, but I was close. I wrapped myself in a large, soft towel, sat on the edge of the bed, and checked my phone. No message from Catherine. None. I pressed my lips together tightly. It wasn't a surprise, but it still hurt, as if an invisible hand was squeezing my chest. I called reception to ask for laundry service. They came for my clothes, including the old jacket I hadn't taken off in days. In the hotel restaurant, I ordered a creamy soup, garlic toast, and a roasted chicken with herbs. I ate slowly, without rushing, as if my stomach still didn't trust that there would be another meal after this. At the end of dinner, Samuel called. "Everything is ready to transfer the administration of the properties," he informed me. "Tomorrow, we'll tour 3 of the main buildings so you can get to know them." I thanked him quietly. I went back to my room. I combed my hair with a hotel comb to look more presentable. An employee brought up a new suit, navy blue, ironed, perfectly folded. I held it up in front of the mirror and, for a moment, I didn't recognize the man reflected there. Before going to bed, I opened a second envelope from Linda's file. It was short, just a few lines. "If anyone hurts you, remember, you are not alone." I closed my eyes. I clutched the paper in my fingers. I put it on the nightstand, turned off the light, and settled under the soft sheets. That night, I slept deeply, without stirring, without being cold, without fear. It was the first time in a long time that my body remembered what it was to rest. At dawn, light streamed in through the translucent curtains. The phone vibrated. It was a message from Samuel. "I'll pick you up in 30 minutes. Today we begin." I got up, put on the new suit, and took a deep breath. I didn't know exactly what awaited me, but for the first time in many years I felt like I was moving towards something new, something big, something mine. And I knew, as I closed the suite door behind me, that this was only the beginning of a completely different life. The next morning I went down to the hotel lobby wearing the blue suit Samuel had asked me to wear. I felt strange in it, as if I were wearing someone else's life. Samuel was already there, standing by a sofa, a thick briefcase in one hand. When he saw me, he looked up and nodded. "Good morning, Mr. Ale." "It will be a long day," he said, wasting no time. The driver opened the door of the black sedan, as if the gesture was already a natural protocol for me. I settled into the back seat, still with a certain awkwardness every time someone treated me with more respect than I was used to. Samuel passed me a folder with a detailed itinerary. "We will review 3 main buildings, Bristol Court, Maple Oaks, and Westwood Oaks," he explained. "I want you to see how they work, who manages them, and what decisions you can make as the owner." As we drove down Wilshire Boulevard, the sound of traffic filled the spaces between Samuel's words. He talked about rental prices in the area, about demand in Los Angeles, about corporate tenants. It was a lot of information for one day, but I listened carefully. I wanted to understand. I had to. We arrived at Bristol Court, a medium-sized red brick building. At first glance, it seemed well-maintained, but Samuel winked at me when I noticed some stains on the facade. At the entrance, we were greeted by Marlene, the administrator, a woman in her 40s with her hair pulled back and a fast, confident way of speaking. "It's a pleasure to meet you, Mr. Ale," she said, shaking my hand. "I didn't know you were coming today." Samuel gave a slight smile. From now on, he will participate in all important decisions. I felt a little jolt. It was strange to be introduced that way. Marlene led us down the hallways. The smell of disinfectant and old paint mingled. In one stretch of the hallway, 2 lights were flickering. Marlene sighed. "We have requests to replace them, but we're still waiting for budget approval." Samuel looked at me, as if wordlessly asking if I wanted to authorize it. I nodded simply. "Do it today," I said. Marlene was surprised, but her smile was genuine. "Thank you, sir. I'll call the electrician now." We went up to the roof to check the ventilation system. The sun reflected off the hot metal. Samuel explained the annual costs, the filter change schedules, the importance of inspections. I asked a few simple questions, and he answered without impatience. For the first time in many days, I felt like someone was teaching me something without judging me. After almost an hour, we returned to the car and headed to Maple Oaks. When we arrived, I saw several workers on scaffolding, painting the facade. Their hands, clothes, and even their faces were stained with white paint. Trevor, the administrator, approached, wiping his hands on a rag. "Welcome, Mr. Ale," he said. "We're renovating the front, as you can see." Trevor took us to the fire control system room. He showed us panels, alarms, reports. Samuel asked for the list of tenants behind on rent. Trevor pulled out a printed spreadsheet and spread it on a table. My eyes went directly to the third line. Brian Mercer, Unit 3B, 1 month overdue. My heart gave a small lurch. Samuel watched me out of the corner of his eye. "What do you want us to do?" he asked quietly. I clenched my jaw, took a deep breath, and replied, "Proceed as required. Nothing special." Trevor nodded without further comment. "I'll send the second notification today." We left the building. I still felt a knot in my stomach, but I kept quiet. I didn't want my emotions to interfere with professional decisions. The third destination was Westwood Oaks. As soon as the car turned the corner, I recognized the place. I had changed light bulbs in that building myself when Catherine lived there alone. Seeing it again, from the window of a luxury car, gave me a strange feeling, as if life were showing me a distorted reflection of the past. Dennis, the administrator, appeared at the entrance with a tablet in hand. He greeted us and began to guide us through the building. In the mail area, I saw several packages piled up. Some had been there for weeks. "There are tenants who never pick up their things," Dennis explained. "We've already sent notices, but nothing." Then he opened an app and showed me the debt chart. 3 apartments appeared in red. Among them, one stood out like an open wound. Unit 3F, Mercer and Ale. My chest tightened. It was Catherine's apartment, the place where Brian had built his silent dominion. I cleared my throat. "What is the behavior of the tenants in 3F?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. Dennis lowered his voice. "The husband is complicated, very impulsive. And the wife? Well, she seems to be afraid of him." I nodded slowly. "Do what the law requires. No exceptions." Dennis was silent, but he understood perfectly. We went down to the parking garage to check the security cameras. Some were partially or totally covered by dry vines. "I'll fix it this week," Dennis promised, taking notes. When we finished the tour, Samuel suggested lunch at a small sandwich shop 2 blocks away. We sat by the window. He ordered coffee, I ordered water. While we ate, he explained the income and expense flows, the pricing policy, pending repairs, and how tenant conflicts were handled. He took out a form. "This document authorizes me to send rent adjustments to all properties. Just for this initial stage, until you're fully familiar with the operation." I took the pen. My hand trembled for a second, but I signed. I felt like I was officially entering an unknown world, one that Linda had quietly built for me. Samuel took me to a store to buy a new phone and a SIM card for work. In the afternoon, I returned to the hotel. When I opened the door to my suite, I found my shirts folded, my old jacket hanging up, everything impeccably tidy. That contrast, my humble clothes in a luxury room, gave me a feeling I wasn't sure was gratitude or displacement. I turned on the TV just to have background noise while I reviewed the emails Samuel had sent. There were over 150 pages of reports. I focused on one tab, Westwood Oaks, adjusted rent notice. The notice had already been sent. Below it was a list of tenant responses. The first one read, "Brian Mercer, voicemail received 6:47 p.m. requests to meet with the owner." I stared at the screen for a few seconds. Then I closed it, without listening to the message. At 7:30 p.m., the room phone rang. It was the reception, informing me there was a package for me. I went down to get it. It was another suit, navy blue, perfectly packaged. I took it to the room and hung it in the closet, thinking that I had never in my life owned 2 new suits at the same time. Before going to bed, I went out onto the balcony. From there, the car lights formed bright, endless lines. The night air carried a faint smell of hot asphalt and distance. I leaned on the railing and breathed deeply. The second day of my new life as an owner was over. I knew that the next day there would be more work, more decisions, more revelations. But for the first time in a long time, I wasn't afraid. Just a strange, quiet calm, as if I was finally occupying a place that had always been destined for me, even though I didn't know it. The next morning, with the suit from the day before still hanging behind the door, I went down to the lobby to meet Samuel. He was already there, reviewing thick papers in a black briefcase. He greeted me with a serious but kind nod. "Today, we make it all official," he said as we walked out to the street. The black sedan was waiting. The driver opened the back door for me with the same usual courtesy. It didn't surprise me as much anymore, but I still felt that little twinge of discomfort, as if the luxurious seat wasn't really mine. As we moved through the morning traffic of Los Angeles, Samuel reviewed every step of the legal process. We arrived at the corporate building where Ale Properties LLC would operate. We entered a meeting room with a long table, 6 chairs, and a pile of documents that looked like they could hold a door open. The lawyer handling the company registration brought in 6 binders, each almost the size of an old phone book. "Each one requires your signature, Mr. Ale," he told me gently. "Here, here, and here." I spent over an hour signing. My hand got tired several times. I had to stop to stretch it. Samuel explained certain terms, clauses I had never heard of, concepts that belonged to a world Linda had secretly lived in for years, while I was still fixing rusty pipes. When we finished, Samuel opened his laptop and started reviewing the emails received from the 3 building administrators. With a raised eyebrow, he commented, "Most accepted the rent adjustment without complaint. A few had minor questions. And here," he paused. He looked at the screen with a mixture of amusement and resignation. "This one is from Brian Mercer." My chest tightened, though I showed no visible sign. Samuel lowered his voice a bit. "He's threatening to sue the owner for abusive increase and harassment." He added, "He has no idea who you are." I tried to keep my face neutral, but I felt a warm knot rising from my stomach. It wasn't pride or satisfaction. It was a more bitter mix. Disappointment, weariness, a kind of sadness that no longer surprised me. "Proceed as the law dictates," I told him. "I want no exceptions." Samuel nodded immediately. He closed the computer and invited me to visit 2 more buildings. One small one in Fairfax, boutique style, with narrow balconies and hanging plants. Another in Santa Monica, old, with elevators that looked like they were from the 72nds. In Fairfax, an elderly woman approached me slowly, leaning on a cane. She introduced herself as Mrs. Morales, and told me the elevator got stuck almost every day. "I don't have the knees to climb 3 floors anymore," she told me with a shy smile. "I'll send a technician today," I replied. "I promise you." The woman took my hand for a second, as if the gesture meant much more than I imagined. As we were leaving, Samuel received a message. He read it, sighed, and passed me the phone so I could see the text. It was from Dennis, the administrator of Westwood Oaks. "Unit 3F, officially 2 months behind. Final notice sent." My heart clenched, but I kept my gaze steady. "Do you want to wait before starting the eviction process?" Samuel asked me, giving me space. I shook my head. "No, do what's required." Inside, it hurt. Of course it hurt. It was my daughter's house. It was my son-in-law's name. It was the same place where I had been told I was a burden. But I also knew that allowing more time would only feed a problem that had been growing like mold on wood for years. That afternoon, Samuel filed the papers to request the eviction hearing, not just for 3F, but for 2 other apartments that were chronically behind. I signed everything with a calmness I didn't know I possessed. 3 days later, I received a brief message from Samuel. Hearing, Friday, 9 a.m. We arrived at the courthouse with time to spare. The building had a mixed smell of dampness, paper, and old coffee. We sat in the back row. I leaned forward a little, trying not to be noticed. 10 minutes later, Brian and Catherine entered. He was wearing a wrinkled shirt, had a scruffy beard, and his eyes were red as if he hadn't slept. Catherine walked behind him, her gaze fixed on the floor, clutching a folded folder. She didn't look up once. Brian was making quick, desperate calls, his leg bouncing nonstop. Several times he hit the seat in front of him with an open hand. I watched it all from a distance, feeling an uncomfortable hollowness in my chest. It wasn't anger, it was something else. The bitter feeling of seeing what my own daughter's life had become. When the clerk called the case, Brian stood up, pulling Catherine by the arm. He walked past me without recognizing me. He smelled like cold coffee and anxiety. In front of the judge, Brian puffed out his chest and spoke loudly, almost theatrically. "This owner is inhuman. He raised the rent without justification. He's abusing us, a family with a young child." Catherine glanced over, surprised. They didn't have any children. I wanted to intervene, to say something, but Samuel brushed my arm as a signal to stay calm. The judge asked for proof of payment. Brian fumbled with his phone, swiped the screen several times, but he had no receipts. Catherine tried to explain in a trembling voice, "We've been going through financial difficulties." But Brian cut her off with a sharp whisper, "Shut up. Let me talk." Samuel approached the table and handed over the documents. The contract, notifications, market adjustments, and the complete history of pending payments. The judge reviewed them for barely a minute. "Unit 3F," he said in a firm tone. 2 months without payment. There is no evidence of payment. The decision is eviction within a maximum of 10 days. Brian slammed his hand on the table. The sound echoed in the room. The judge looked up. "One more outburst and I will sanction you, Mr. Mercer." Catherine burst into tears. She raised a hand, asking for a little more time, but the judge shook his head. 10 days. I cannot authorize more." Brian stormed out first, furious, kicking a chair in the hallway. Catherine followed him with small steps, wiping away the tears that wouldn't stop falling. I watched them go, never knowing I was right there. So close. Samuel gathered the papers and looked at me discreetly. "Do you wish to speak with them now?" I thought for a few seconds. I looked at the door they had left through, heard the echoes of Catherine's footsteps fading down the corridor. "No," I said finally. "Not yet." We left the courthouse. A strong wind was blowing, kicking up dry leaves and moving the hem of my jacket. In the parking lot, the black sedan gleamed under the midday sun. "Are you all right?" Samuel asked as we got in the car. "Yes," I replied. "I'm as I should be." As the car pulled away from the courthouse, Samuel's phone vibrated. He looked at the screen, silenced it, and put the phone face down. "Brian," he said, without emotion. "He's left another message. Threats mixed with pleas. Blindly. A man who doesn't understand that the power he had over others is crumbling because it never belonged to him." In the distance, I watched the courthouse grow smaller through the window. The clouds were moving fast. An ray of light broke through, landing on a crosswalk. I took a deep breath. "Samuel," I said, without taking my eyes off the road, "I think the time has come." He nodded, as if he had been waiting for my words for days. "Then we will prepare everything," he replied. And just like that, I knew the next step wouldn't be legal or administrative. It would be personal. Very personal. The morning after the hearing, with the judge's voice still echoing in my head, I received a message from Samuel at 7:12 a.m. It was short, but it said exactly what I expected. "Brian has called 3 more times this morning. He insists on meeting with the owner. Period." I replied immediately with a surprisingly steady hand. "Arrange the meeting. Office 1407. Samuel agreed without asking questions and added that it would be good for me to arrive 20 minutes early to get everything set up. I took the navy blue suit they had given me the day before and laid it carefully on the bed. I looked at it for a few seconds. The fabric seemed too good for a man who, just 2 weeks ago, was sleeping on a cement bench. Still, I put it on calmly. I adjusted the tie in the mirror, combed my still damp hair, and took a deep breath before leaving the room. The driver was waiting downstairs. He opened the car door for me with the same courtesy as always. During the ride, Samuel called to review the final details. "Sit on the inside of the table," he told me. "I want him to see you as soon as he enters." I nodded without a word. His tone was professional, but there was a clear intention behind it, to make the truth land on Brian without any warning. We arrived at the glass building. The elevator took longer than usual to go up, maybe because of the number of people at that hour, but I finally reached the 14th floor. Samuel was already there, standing in front of the door to office 1407, with a composure so calm it made me think he had lived through hundreds of scenes like this. "Take a seat here," he instructed. "Let's keep the bottle of water nearby, and these documents, leave them in sight." He placed 3 thick folders on the table. One of them had Linda's name written on it by hand. It hurt a little to see it, but I let it stay there. Barely 10 minutes passed when Samuel's phone rang. It was the receptionist from the floor below. "Brian Mercer has arrived. He's on his way up." Samuel gave me a signal to straighten my back. I sat up firmly, my hands resting on the table, trying to contain any shaking. He positioned himself to the side of the room, like a neutral observer. The door burst open without a knock. Brian entered first. His hair was messy, he had deep dark circles, and his shirt was wrinkled. His movements were fast, nervous. Behind him came Catherine, her face clearly exhausted. Her eyes were swollen, as if she hadn't slept. Brian took 2 steps and then froze. His gaze shot through me as if he had seen a ghost. Catherine took a second longer to react, but when she saw me sitting there, her lips parted and she brought a hand to her mouth. "Dad," she stammered. "What? What are you doing here?" I didn't answer. There was no need. Brian blinked several times, as if his brain was trying to reconstruct the scene. What the hell is this?" he said, looking at Samuel. "I asked to speak with the owner of the building, not with him." Samuel replied with an almost surgical calm, "He is the owner of the building." The silence that fell was so heavy I could feel it in my chest. Brian's mouth opened, but no words came out. He looked at Catherine as if searching for support, but she avoided his gaze. Finally, he managed to articulate, He's the what?" "That's right," Samuel said. "He is the general owner of all 13 properties." Brian swallowed, took 2 steps closer to the table, and repeated, "You're behind the rent increase?" "Yes," I replied. Catherine slowly sat down in the chair across from me, still clutching her crumpled folder. She seemed to be trying to understand something that had been escaping her for a long time. "Why didn't you tell me, Dad?" she murmured. "Why?" "There was never an opportunity," I answered. "And you know why." She looked down. Then Brian changed completely. The surprise lasted less time than I expected. As soon as he thought he had regained his footing, he leaned forward, trying to be imposing. "What do you want? Revenge? To make me look like an idiot?" Samuel intervened before I could answer. "Watch your tone. This meeting is being recorded." Brian took a deep breath, trying to compose himself. Then, feigning cordiality, he sat down and said, "Let's talk like adults. This can all be fixed." I slid the folder with the delinquency notice, the judge's order, and the process documents toward him. I said nothing. There was no need. Brian took them, glanced at the first few pages, and his expression changed again. He paused when he saw Linda's signature on some old contracts, and his eyes widened slightly. Catherine began to cry silently. Her hand was shaking as she opened her own rental folder. She tried to explain, "Dad, I didn't want this. We've been having problems, but—" Brian interrupted her abruptly. "You don't have to apologize. It's not your fault. It's his fault for not wanting to help us." Samuel, now visibly tired of Brian's attitude, spoke firmly. "We're not here to argue about blame. We're here to execute a court order." Brian leaned towards me, this time with a softer, almost pleading tone. "Look, Jonathan, give me 3 months. Just 3. I'll pay everything. I give you my word." I looked him in the eye. There was no hatred in me, only clarity. "The judge's decision is 10 days, I replied. Brian gritted his teeth. Catherine broke down, covering her face. "Dad, it's me. I'm sorry. I'm sorry for all of this." I nodded. Not to forgive her, or to blame her, just to acknowledge her pain. Brian shot up from his chair. He pushed it back, looking around like a cornered animal. You could tell he wanted to scream, but he knew he was at a disadvantage. He lowered his voice and addressed Samuel. "Let's negotiate. We can always negotiate something." "The only thing I can negotiate," Samuel replied, "is the exact day you will leave the apartment. Within the 10-day period. Nothing more." Brian cursed under his breath. Catherine, exhausted, stood up slowly and walked toward the door. He tried to grab her arm, but she dodged him, without looking at him. "Dad," she said one more time, in a thin whisper. I wish things had been different," and she left. Brian followed her with hurried steps. The door closed, not with a slam, but with a weight that was felt in the whole body. Samuel gathered the documents. Everything legal is closed, he told me. Now you can get on with your life. I stood up, buttoned my jacket, and took a deep breath. Samuel asked if I wanted to go to Westwood Oaks to supervise the move-out when the day came. No, I replied. That's what I have administrators for. We went out into the hallway and got into the elevator. The doors closed slowly, and I saw my reflection in the polished metal. I was no longer the man who had been thrown onto the street with a suitcase and 200 crumpled dollars. I was someone new, someone who had finally reclaimed his place. The next morning I left the Paramount Regency Hotel with a calm that still surprised me. The lobby was full of tourists checking their bags, employees pushing carts with clean towels, baristas serving coffee in a hurry. I walked out the revolving doors with just one suitcase and an address written on a piece of paper Samuel had given me last night. Pasadena. A quiet neighborhood, he said. A small house, just what you want. The driver dropped me off in front of a street lined with maple trees, their leaves some already a pale red covered part of the sidewalk. The house was in the middle of the block, a one-story home with a chocolate-colored tile roof, a small front garden, and a stone path leading to the front door. I put the key in the lock, and, as I opened it, a soft smell of fresh paint enveloped me. The living room was simple, with a large window overlooking the backyard. The kitchen, though smaller than Catherine's, had a quiet charm. Light wood cabinets, a new electric stove, and a countertop where I imagined making coffee early. I touched each faucet, just to check the water pressure. Old habits I didn't know how to abandon. The faucets worked perfectly. I heard the strong, solid sound as if the house was telling me I could trust it. A few minutes later, Samuel arrived with a thin folder and a restrained smile. Here is the final contract. He handed me the official keys. As of today, this house is yours. I signed the papers without rushing. I no longer felt the anxiety of signing like in the first days with him. Now, things had a different rhythm, more certain, more mine. I walked Samuel to the door and watched him get into the black car which pulled away slowly down the street. When the house was quiet, I unpacked my suitcase. I hung my shirts in the closet, folded my pants, put my socks in the smallest drawer. The simple routine gave me back a sense of control I hadn't had in a long time. I walked to the nearest supermarket. I bought bread, vegetables, some chicken, and a small pot of yellow flowers that caught my eye. I placed it on the kitchen windowsill, right where the afternoon light came in. At 4, I went out to the backyard. I found a set of gardening tools left by the previous owners. I started pulling weeds, turning the soil carefully. The warm breeze touched my neck. An elderly neighbor stopped at the fence. "I'm Martha," she said, smiling. "I live in the corner house. If you want, I have some better shears for trimming those branches." I accepted the loan. Her kindness was simple, genuine. It reminded me of times I thought I had lost. While I was pruning the rose bush, some kids on bikes rode by, laughing, down the street. One of them raised his hand and waved at me as if he had known me before. I waved back and kept cutting until the bush took on a decent shape. I bought some potting soil and made a small rectangle in a corner of the garden. I pressed the earth with my knuckles, breathing in the damp smell that always made me think of my childhood. When evening fell, I turned on the porch light and sat in a wooden chair, looking at the neighborhood. The silence was different from the nights on the street. Here, there was no fear, no hurried footsteps, no drunken voices. Just the distant sound of a car passing and the gentle movement of the maple branches. The phone vibrated. It was a message from Samuel. "Brian and Catherine have left apartment 3F. The administrator has already changed the lock." I replied simply, "Understood." I put the phone away, feeling no triumph or relief. Just a quiet acceptance that this chapter was finally closed. 3 days later, I decided to go to the volunteer center in Glendale, just as I had been thinking for some time. I asked about the food distribution program. They gave me a light jacket with the center's logo, and I joined the group preparing trays for families in need. As we were handing them out, I recognized someone in the line. Mickey. His beard was a little longer, but it was him. When he saw me, his eyes went wide. "Well, look at you, Ale," he said, laughing. "You look like a politician now." I laughed too and handed him an extra food packet. "I'm just starting over," I said. "That's life," he replied, putting the packet in his backpack. "It takes strange turns, but sometimes it surprises us." We said goodbye there, among boxes of fruit and bags of bread. and for the first time in a long time I felt like I was giving back a little of what I had received. That night I returned to my new house. I showered, made a hot tea, and pinned Linda's letter to a corkboard above my desk. Right next to it, I placed the first utility bill for the new home. It was my way of telling myself that everything old and new had its own place in this house. I opened the window. The night air came in, smelling of freshly cut grass. I closed my eyes for a few seconds. At 9 o'clock the phone vibrated again. Catherine. I stood still, feeling a slight weight in my chest. Not pain, something more complex, I answered. Dad. Her voice was weak, as if she had been crying. I left Brian's house. I'm staying with a friend. I need time to fix myself. There was a brief silence. I could hear her shaky breathing. I'd like to see you, she added. When you're ready. I don't want to force you. I looked out at the backyard through the glass. The maple leaves trembled gently under the yellow porch light. We can see each other, I said, when we're both truly ready. She let out a short sob, but this time it wasn't out of fear. It was relief. Thank you, Dad, she whispered. After hanging up, I went out to the patio again. I turned on the small solar lights I had staked along the fence that morning. They lit the garden with a faint, warm glow. I took the watering can, watered the freshly turned earth, and smelled the damp soil rising from the grass. Above me, a few stars fought to shine through the city's light pollution. I stayed like that for several minutes, without moving, listening to the faint chirp of crickets. Then I closed the door, turned off the lights, and made my bed. That day wasn't just the end of a painful story. It was the quiet, firm beginning of a completely new life.